When we think of the Battle of Culloden, pop culture usually hands us a romantic tragedy. Wild, screaming Highlanders charging heroically into the fire and bayonets of the British war machine. But to understand what actually happened and why it happened, we have to look past the pop history and the Hollywood myths. Welcome back to Prime and Load. My name is Lee Gangino, and as always, I'm joined by Doctors Alex Burns and Andrew Bamford. We're at the climax of our Jacobite Rising series, and we're very fortunate to be joined once again by our friend Dr. Aaron Johnston. Culloden is likely the most famous and romanticized battle of the entire rebellion, but with Aaron's help, we're going to strip away all the years of legends and lores and myths surrounding the battle. Together, we're going to look at the grim realities of the Jacobite army's final hours. We're going to examine the catastrophic night march to Nairn, the rapidly crumbling relationship between Charles Edward and some of his commanders, and the tactical reality of the battle. Thank you for joining us for the Battle of Culloden. So, Aaron, we're back. We're talking about Jacobites once again, and this is episode number 6, and a lot has happened. The last episode we talked about kind of that in-between time period between the victory at Falkirk and what we're going to talk about today, the Battle of Culloden. Can you kind of give us a recap of that kind of intermittent period?
Yeah, so we'd picked the story up last time after the Jacobite tactical victory at Falkirk Moor in the middle of January 1746, after which they then made this remarkable decision, much against the wishes, it must be said, of Prince Charles Edward himself, to retreat from their positions around Stirling and abandon the lowlands, essentially in the weeks that followed that victory. Charles Edward raging that victory and defeat had had the same strategic outcome after their battle at Falkirk. So the Jacobite army at the beginning of February 1746 had retreated across the Firth of Forth, a sort of symbolic barrier between North and South Scotland, and had headed up into the Highlands in principally 2 columns, moving up, the Prince moving up through the Central Highlands, and the other column under Lord George Murray going up the northeast coast of Scotland. And what this means is that over the first weeks and months of 1746, the Jacobites had been giving up territory that had been pretty hard fought for, especially up in the northeast of Scotland. And not only are they losing territory and losing, of course, all the momentum and morale of success that they'd been building so far, but they're also losing the potential access points that France has to be able to feed them with supplies, money, troops. And of course, they've got the Duke of Cumberland in relatively close pursuit. He's not overdoing it. He's pushing. He already thinks the war has essentially been won, and the Jacobites start dispersing, but not as he initially thinks, to disperse back to their homes, having abandoned thoughts of victory. In fact, there's a sudden sort of resurgence of Jacobite success stories as they successfully take Ruthven Barracks, they successfully take Inverness and Fort George, they successfully take the fortification at Fort Augustus, and they lay siege to Blair Castle and Fort William. So the Jacobites managed to demonstrate by the early March 1746 that actually they are far from spent. They still have thousands of men in arms, 6,000 or 7,000 men still marching under Jacobite banners, and this war is far from over. But there is a very real sense that there is a ticking clock now for the Jacobites. They have been marching and fighting now through an increasingly bitter winter, and winters in the Highlands of Scotland are generally quite difficult to campaign in. This one seems to be particularly unpleasant after an unusually mild summer and autumn. So this is tough campaigning for both armies, but the Jacobites are running out of money, running out of supplies, running out of territory, running out of time. And so there is a sense by the time we get towards April 1746 that there is going to have to be, very quickly, a major confrontation again.
And how many men are we looking at on both sides?
So we're looking at probably in terms of Cumberland's army, something around 7,500 men that are available for in the field army. The Jacobites have the same numbers, but they don't have them all in one place. I mentioned, I think, towards the close of the last episode, the fact that they had detached forces up to the very north of Scotland, and they had hoped to try and recover some of the French supplies and finances that had landed up there. So there are, 400-500 men north of the Moray Firth, and there are hundreds of others on recruitment drives, as well as those that have come in from the other operations. So as we move towards the final clash, there are still perhaps 1,000 men, perhaps more, who haven't come into the field army. So our Jacobite army is considerably bigger than the one that had won the battle at Prestonpans, when they'd won the battle with 2,500 men, but considerably smaller than the one that had fought at Falkirk in January. So the Jacobite army, depending on which day you look at it, is shifting. By the time the confrontation comes, it's getting close towards 6,000, but it's probably still shy of that number when the battle actually begins.
And so, switching over to the government forces side of things, you said Cumberland is bringing his army up through the Highlands, and he's having some difficulties with the weather. Can you kind of walk us through the opening stages of his offensive towards and into the Highlands?
Yeah, so Cumberland, once we're into sort of the second half of March, starts pushing units towards Inverness. There is a significant sort of geographical line between Inverness and Aberdeen, the line of the River Spey. And so they're pushing out towards that. The Jacobites devolve command of their defence along the Spey to the Duke of Perth, and who's proven himself, despite having no previous military experience, to be extremely energetic and capable during the course of the campaign so far. And Cumberland has a couple of times, the government forces during these first few months have had their whiskers singed a little bit when they've stretched themselves too thinly. This had happened in Perthshire, for example, when they hadn't expected Murray's thrust down towards Blair Athol and so on. And again, it happens near the Spey. That part of Kingston's Light Horse are pushed up to Keith in the second half of March, and they're surprised. And there's a pretty ferocious firefight around the church there, and most of the detachment are taken prisoner. And crucially for the Jacobites, 30 or 40 odd horses are taken as well. So the Jacobites are still showing that they've got bite. Cumberland isn't able to dilute, so he keeps the army fairly concentrated. Moves out of Aberdeen on what's more or less a direct road between Inverness and Aberdeen. Very important route across the south side of the Moray Estuary. And the decision is made by the Duke of Perth that the line of the River Spey cannot be held against Cumberland. Cumberland's got substantial forces. He's got artillery batteries. He's got substantial cavalry forces at his disposal too, and so the Spey is not the sort of river line that you can hold with small irregular forces, because there are multiple potential crossing points along its length, and so there is a decision made by Perth not to hold that line. He has been criticised for that at the time and subsequently, but I think actually he does a fairly good job of bringing the sort of screen of troops that he had along the river together and withdrawing them to Nairn. And Cumberland therefore is able to successfully bring his forces across the river and follow that up. Perth subsequently withdraws from Nairn directly to Inverness, and it's at Nairn Cumberland camps on the into the 14th and 15th of April. So that's Nairn is 10 miles or so from Inverness, and so now we are the Jacobites, as I've said, are concentrating at Inverness. They are not withdrawing further at this point, and so it's inevitable by the midpoint in April that the confrontation is going to take place. That is not to say that there are no voices for retreat in the Jacobite army, or at least perhaps I should qualify that that there aren't very significant discussions about where the confrontation should take place. Lord George Murray is advocating by the start of the 15th of April. For a position further down the River Nairn, where they could potentially hold a defensive position on the banks of the river. There, it's quite steep and difficult ground. But obviously, and this is debated, and it's debated pretty hotly. And it has been debated ever since. I think the conversation is still rumbling on. As to whose battlefield was the one that should have been chosen. But Murray Pittock and others have argued very convincingly, I think, that the position proposed by Lord George Murray was flawed in a lot of ways, not least the fact that it forces the Jacobites to fight a defensive battle against an enemy with superior firepower, which is not going to be easy. And sacrifices many of the shock advantages of obviously the way that the Highlanders in the front line would particularly want to fight an engagement. The site that Murray advocates for is a couple of miles further along the river than the site at Culloden. The other tactical problem, sort of strategic problem, really, with that location is that it essentially abandons Inverness. However, temporarily, if you win the battle, it perhaps doesn't matter, but it does put Inverness out of your reach. And if that is your depot and your supply point, then it means that you have no real option other than to retreat further from there into the glens, and so it's that point was challenged too. It was the site was assessed by a number of Jacobite officers, including John MacDonald and others, and their assessment was that the ground was unsuitable, that it was boggy, that it was entangled, it was difficult to deploy in, and that it just simply wasn't suitable for a pitched battle. Now, how you assess all of these arguments is entirely bound up in the prejudices that have subsequently grown around the historiography of the 45. Those who are the big defenders of Lord George Murray, which is the strong 19th century tradition that is still very popular, they inevitably say, well, since Lord George Murray's battlefield was rejected, and then the outcome was subsequently as it was, they'd have been better going with his option. That's easier with hindsight. It doesn't actually in any way suggest that the outcome would have been guaranteed to be any different. The strongest advocates arguing against Murray's position, men like John Sullivan and John MacDonald, both Irishmen, both Catholics, both seen as being hostile to Murray, both seen through partisan prejudice, sectarian eyes at the time and subsequently, and so. So the assessment of the battlefields is fraught in that sense, but it is clear that the battlefields, the potential battlefields, were considered, were surveyed, were assessed, were debated, and the decision was taken to choose the site at Dromozi Moor, which is to the east of Inverness, which therefore means the battle is essentially being fought for control of Inverness. And it should be stressed that the battlefield that is chosen is not actually technically the battlefield where the battle is fought, because, as we'll no doubt go on to explain, the Jacobite deployments are determined by events ultimately, rather than by the forward plan. So although they're in the same general area as was initially planned, they're on a slightly different alignment. But this is an army now by the middle of as I say, by the 15th of April, that is looking for ways to neutralise the advantages that it perceives the enemy as having, particularly in terms of its firepower. And one of the concerns that they have is that, for the first time it seems likely that artillery might play a part in this battle. At neither of the previous battles, the artillery train at Prestonpans had been pretty ineffective anyway, even on paper, and had performed very badly on the day. The artillery train at Falkirk hadn't got up onto the battlefield in time to do anything at all, and had been subsequently entirely captured by the Jacobites. Whereas the nature of Cumberland's advance, unless something dramatic happens, it is likely that he'll be able to deploy on the open ground at Culloden. So there are potential differences and factors that the Jacobites are trying to mitigate here.
I mean, the other option, of course, that we haven't considered yet, but obviously which we know was considered at the time, is to take the fight to the enemy, and the projected attack on Cumberland in Nairn, which I think certainly some would argue shapes the state the Jacobite army was in when we actually get the battle. So could you talk us through the thinking behind that and how that aspect of it plays out?
Yeah, absolutely. The night march on Nairn is very significant. So if we're in the position of the Jacobite High Command on the 15th of April, we've spent a lot of time thrashing out and arguing between senior commanders which location is best to pin the enemy in. A concentration point and deployment point at Culloden had been agreed, and that's where the army was concentrating. But as had happened at Prestonpans, almost organically, but as had happened before Falkirk very deliberately, the Jacobites then decide not simply to form up on the moor and wait for the enemy to come to them, but to do something to pull out another one of their surprise marches that will take the fight over to Cumberland. And again, that is designed as a means of negating the perceived advantages that Cumberland's army has, and to fight on the Jacobite terms when the British army is not fully deployed and ready for them. So there's a lot of sort of mud as to whose idea this initially is, although I think it's actually fair to say that because the Jacobites have done this consistently before battles, that it was probably no radical suggestion, and it was likely discussed pretty openly on the afternoon of the 15th. A number of Jacobites, including people like O'Sullivan, say that it was Lord George Murray's idea to openly articulate it. Others say that it was the Prince's idea. I think what we probably have is a relatively rare instance of them both agreeing in principle that it's best to do something dramatic. And Charles Edward was always for aggressive offensive action if such a plan was presented to him. So this discussion is, I think there is a sense when it's looked at in hindsight through some of the Jacobite memoirs that some saw it as a sort of desperate attempt to try and even the odds. I think actually, it is a little bit more nuanced than that. I think they genuinely saw an opportunity here, pulling off an 8 or 9 mile march over quite difficult terrain. Is something that they did successfully before the Battle of Falkirk, and so it's not impossible they can achieve it again. The difference this time is that the proposal is to do it at night. Again, they have done similar at Prestonpans, much shorter route, but they did it before the dawn. and with a much less experienced army. But to move by night here is determined by various factors. Firstly, of course, they've got a long way to go, but through terrain that is dotted with settlements, and is presumably dotted with pickets, and there is a significant risk that Jacobites are detected on that march, and that it's all in vain. The other problem, as I'd already alluded to, is that the Royal Navy is watching what the Jacobites are doing on Culloden Moor, and so the army doesn't feel that it can move until after darkness. And so it's not until about seven in the evening that they actually start moving. So it is a very difficult operation that they agree to go to undertake, and as I say, it wasn't universally accepted as being the best. As being, nobody expected this to be an easy trick to pull, but there does seem to have been a consensus that if we pull it, then it will have been worth it. And so the intention, Cumberland's forces camped up outside Nairn. The cavalry and infantry were separated. There was a belief that it was possible to launch an attack on those encampments. Part of the trigger for this conversation is Lord Elcho, David Weems, young, very headstrong, pretty arrogant, 25-year-old lad. If I call him that, it's quite patronising, but you know what I mean. And he is an aristocratic and very gung ho guy who subsequently will fall out with Prince Charles Edward in exile. But nevertheless, he's commander of Charles Edward's Life Guards and has been very a close intimate of him through the campaign. And Elcho, as a senior cavalry officer, he is responsible for the scouting towards Cumberland's position at Nairn on the 15th. He comes back to Culloden with the report not only of Cumberland's position, but also a pretty definitive statement that there seems to be no preparation in Cumberland's camp for an imminent march. And that's an important factor in the Jacobite decision to go to them. There is this sense that if they are not preparing to come to us, and you see echoes again of the discussion before Falkirk, where the Jacobites had formed up on the moor for 3 or 4 days preceding the battle, and every time they'd done it, the army had got slower at attending the call to arms, and so Jacobite army, which is now concentrating, which has very significant problems with supply now, is going to struggle to keep itself together in one place at its full strength if Cumberland decides just to sit 10 miles away for a couple of days. To put that into context, Charles Edward, having been told that of the scale of the problems Restalrig is having in getting supplies up to Culloden from Inverness, he orders all the supplies to be brought up as quickly as they can. He intervenes personally to try and get the logistics moving. But of the supplies that come up, half of the biscuit hasn't been baked. There's not much they can do about that on the moor on a very cold, wet, miserable mid-April. There's enough for a distribution on the afternoon of the 15th of April of about 1 biscuit per head, which isn't particularly substantial. And so Charles Edward is very much aware that if he doesn't get the army moving and tick the army into action and force the issue, then he's going to start having real problems, not just with supply, because given enough time and enough organisation in Inverness, some of these problems can be temporarily overcome. The real problem is they can see that men are starting to drift off from the moor to go and find their own food, and that is being observed, and so they know that there is a potential problem if they don't get the army moving again. So that feeds into this. All those problems feed into this decision to make the night march. It is, as you know, one of the points that I hope I've been making over the course of these episodes is that the Jacobite army, when it put its mind to operations like this, was actually really rather capable. And there are elements of that even in the night march to Nairn. Again, similarly to the Falkirk March, fires are lit across the moorland. Firstly, to try and deceive the Royal Navy into its belief that the Jacobite camp is still there, but also with the intention of directing those late regiments that are coming up to the Muir to where the army needs to be. And some Jacobite soldiers are specifically tasked with remaining at Culloden in order to direct people on along the road to Nairn. So provision is made for that. As I've already said, Keppoch's men have come in that evening, so they are just in the nick of time to participate. But there are others expected. The Frasers and maybe even Cromartys are still being expected. The Jacobite plan is to march in their three divisions as usual. Lord George Murray leading the van, the Duke of Perth with the centre, and Charles Edward with the rearward. And the idea is that Murray's van will take the longest swing and attack Cumberland's forces from the sort of north and west side of the camp, whilst Perth and the centre attacks from the south and the east, and Charles Edward's reserve, as it comes up, backs up Perth's attack. That's the intention. So they've planned the march. They've planned what they're going to do when they get there, and then it's described that as the march gets underway, regiments leave a breadcrumb trail, essentially, of soldiers along the route to keep pushing the regiments from behind on the right tracks. So efforts are clearly made to make the march as straightforward as possible, and to deal with some of the challenges of obviously making a march, a winter march, in the darkness on a minor road. They cannot go the direct road that leads over the high point of the moor towards Nairn, because that is most likely to be detected. So they take a road parallel with the River Nairn, which is sort of in a hollow. It's on lower ground, which means inevitably, given the time of year, that the ground is very poor, is very wet and waterlogged. And there's one Jacobite account that says the road that they're marching on seems scarce to have ever been trodden on by foot. It's in such a state. And if that's the case for the guys at the front, imagine what it might be like for the guys at the back, who are following the wake of 4,000 or 5,000 people who've gone ahead of them. But as I say, I think it is fair to say this isn't a desperate army straggling off on a last desperate gamble, that's just throwing it all in. It is a planned operation. And they have made attempts to mitigate some of the challenges they know they're going to experience on that march. But I caveat that by saying they knew this was going to be a really remarkable thing, and you see that in some of the accounts. Robert Strange, for example, who's with the Jacobite cavalry. He says, that this is the sort of undertaking that is fit for the heroes of old. This is this felt like something straight out of the annals of Bruce and Wallace. If they could pull this off, this would immortalize this army forever.
So just from the way you framed it there, it seems it didn't work. Maybe tell us a little bit why.
Yes. So there are obviously a lot of challenges along that route, all of which they encounter as inevitably. And there have been various attempts over the years to recreate this march on a small scale, of course, and people have done this march preceding the anniversary dates overnight, and it is a very challenging march even today. Because, of course, after a while, you start looking at your feet, not the back of the guy in front of you. The column inevitably starts opening up. And there's a description of Charles Edward being constantly in motion, riding up and down the lines, trying to keep the column together. But gaps clearly open up, particularly between the three divisions. I have to at this point also pick up on a couple of sort of moments in this. Firstly, there is an enduring myth that the principal Jacobite assumption is that all of the British forces are going to be drunk when they get to Nairn, because it's the Duke of Cumberland's birthday, of course. So inevitably that's why Elcho had seen that they were making no effort to move, because they were all having far too much of a time in Nairn. I think that gives the Duke of Cumberland's army relatively little credit, and if that really was an assumption, then it was a naive one. Some of the Jacobites do assert that was one of the points that was raised, and that was part of the discussion, but it clearly wasn't the reason that they chose to make this to make this march. It's the sort of thing you say, well, you never know, and maybe it will be easy enough after all, because they've all had a bit of extra gin when we get there. But it's obviously an enduring point that gets raised. The other is this remarkable moment at the start of the march, when which is only described by John Sullivan. So we have to sort of couch our belief about it. But there's just such a vividness about his description of it, and we know it's in the right location for where he might have witnessed it if he had. Because they were at the front of the column. And I just find it very compelling and potentially very insightful. There's a moment with Charles Edward and Lord George Murray at the start of this march. Now, it's no doubt come across in previous episodes that these men did not agree all the time on the strategic direction of this conflict. But there is perhaps in this moment a sense not only that they both think this march should be undertaken, but also that the crisis point is coming. And what O'Sullivan describes is Charles Edward going up to the front of the column, which Lord George Murray will command, and as the army sets off from the moor, walking alongside him. And he describes specifically how Charles Edward puts his arm over Murray's shoulder and clasps him by the hand with his other hand across his chest as they walk together. It's quite a vivid image of the Prince and his Lieutenant General here. And Sullivan gives Charles Edward a fairly an unusually protracted speech almost for the accounts of the period. And Charles Edward basically says, if you pull this off, my father and I will never forget it. This is the greatest service that you can give us. And I thank you and I bless you. And these are all sentiments and statements which are absolutely in keeping with the character of Charles Edward. So from that perspective, I actually don't doubt that it was said. What Sullivan says is that Charles Edward says these things very heartfelt, and Murray says nothing. He doesn't reply. And Sullivan says that for 5 or 6 minutes, they walk alongside, with the army, setting off on this march in this locked position, with the Prince with his arm around them, and Murray says nothing. After those 5 or 6 minutes, Charles Edward drops his arms and he continues to walk alongside Murray, and Murray says nothing. And eventually Charles Edward then says, okay, well, I'd better take up my position, and Murray takes off his hat and bows, and Charles Edward heads off to the rear of the army and takes up his position with the second. And I find this a really evocative little tableau that summarizes the problems between those two men. Like I say, we only have one description of it, but it's a very vivid one. Sullivan, as Adjutant General and one of the key players, absolutely key players in the organisation and direction of the Jacobite army, is up. We know from other descriptions, he's up at the front of the column with Murray at this point. So he is there. He could have seen it. A couple of minutes later, when Charles Edward is mounted and is at the rear, Sullivan comes back with John MacDonald because he has been told by Lord George Murray he doesn't want him up there at the front with him, so he's dispatched back to the back. So, anyway, I think that is a story worth repeating because I think it opens a little window, I think, on some of those command issues, those personality issues. The march gets underway. It's difficult. It's long. It's 8 miles. It's going to take a long time. It doesn't start until after 7 o'clock, as I've said. And a number of things start to happen. I've already mentioned the fact that these gaps and these stragglers start to appear, and regiments towards the back are having to pick up the stragglers from regiments ahead. And then Henry Kerr, one of the Jacobite staff officers, comes down the line, giving orders from regiment to regiment from Lord George Murray, stating that every regiment is under orders to attack once they get there immediately with sword and targe. There is not going to be a firefight. We're going in hand to hand as soon as you're in position. Surprise, speed, shock and all. So that's the intention. He gets to Prince Charles. He's turned around. He says, "You can go back up to the front now and tell Lord George that you've delivered your message all the way back to the rear of the column." And this is about the halfway point. So that gives us an insight into what they're intending when they get there. But then very soon after Kerr's come down the line, then Cameron of Lochiel comes down the line to see Charles Edward, and he is the first in the middle of this operation to suddenly cast doubt on whether it's plausible. It's a bit late for suddenly declaring that you think this is time to pull out. But Lochiel comes back with concerns that the march is taking too long, then they've not got enough men concentrated, and that they're unlikely to be able to get to surprise the British camp before the dawn. And so Lochiel's coming back and expressing concern. Needless to say, Charles Edward balls him up and says, "Off you go." Charles Edward now starts moving up the column, though. Concerned as to what the mood is up at the front. And then everything gets very confused from here. What essentially happens, when you boil it out, is that Lord George Murray and the vanguard decide pretty much entirely of his own instinct and initiative that it isn't going to be possible for the army to get up and attack the camp under the cover of darkness. Murray, therefore, swings the vanguard around, and if you imagine them on a hairpin, they go along the underlayer of the pin, they turn around, and they go back along the upper layer. So he does not turn his column around and come back down the same road. He goes down a different road, a parallel road, the main direct road that goes straight across the moor, the one that they had rejected as their march route because it was visible to the Royal Navy. And that means that nobody who's now turned away from Nairn and is returning to Culloden is going to encounter any of the men who are coming up behind. And for some reason, which we don't know, this information is not passed to the Duke of Perth and the 2nd Division. So we have the Duke of Perth in the centre and Charles Edward and the rear still marching directly on Nairn as Lord George Murray and the van are withdrawing back to the position at Culloden. When the Duke of Perth starts to get towards the camp, and there are all the usual things you would expect in the accounts of, we can hear the drums in the distance, we think we can smell the sentries coming, and so on. So they think they're getting pretty close. But they cannot find Lord George. They cannot find the vanguard, which should be swinging around and moving into position to launch the attack, to open the attack from further up from around. And so there's now a sort of flurry of efforts by the Jacobite staff and senior Jacobite officers moving up and down the line, trying to work out what on earth has happened. Charles Edward has to come rushing up to talk to the Duke of Perth to try and work out what is going on. And eventually it becomes obvious that Murray is retreating. Charles Edward says some pretty strong words. I think there are various iterations of them that appear in some of the accounts, and inevitably there is a strong sense that he is being betrayed here. What is going on? Why has this army taken a different course of action without consultation of the commander-in-chief, for example, which is not an unreasonable question to raise. But essentially, his hands are bound by this point, and it is necessary, it's crucial, with a third of the army now going backwards, that the rest of it has to go back too. And so the Jacobite army turns itself around, and the rest of it follows back in Murray's wake to Culloden. So the attack, it never happens. It is abandoned, and the Jacobite army, having struggled all through the night on very difficult terrain, in darkness, in the cold, at least it's dry, it's not actively raining or sleeting for most of that night, but it's still pretty awful. They now have to do the reverse march. So they do their 16-mile walk through the night. Charles Edward is back at Culloden House by around 6 a.m. And that is not the ideal beginning to the preparations to a battle later that day. There are various accounts of exactly what happens when Charles Edward is back at Culloden. Some say that when Charles is in the room with Lord George, he is extraordinarily and suspiciously magnanimous, and that he swallows what he might instinctively want to say and brushes it aside because he knows there's a coming crisis now. Others say that extremely strong words are said. I think that is the more likely scenario, given the past history of the two and the seriousness of what's happened. Murray, of course, digs in and simply expresses that the march was too difficult. Murray is very keen, very clear in his memoir of these events to distance himself from the decision to have made the march in the first place. He spends a lot of time explaining why it failed, but doesn't claim any credit for it. Whereas everybody else is, as I say, apart from a few who say it's the prince's idea. So I'm always suspicious when Murray doesn't claim credit for ideas, because it's always the ones that don't work out. But as I say, two different versions of what happens. There's a very small number of men who will have been privy to those exchanges at Culloden House, but everybody is exhausted. Sullivan gives us some nice moments that may or may not be slightly tainted with their desire to paint Charles Edward in a positive light, because Sullivan writes his account for Charles's father as the sort of official report of what's taken place, and says that the prince refuses refreshments because he's more concerned about getting supplies brought up for the men. But the simple reality is that once everybody gets back to that moor, they collapse wherever they can find a spot. Charles Edward is no different. He throws himself fully dressed onto the bed at Culloden House, still in his boots, and catches a couple of hours rest. But the army is now absolutely exhausted. Cromarty's men still haven't arrived. They're never going to, but they don't know that. And some of the Macphersons haven't arrived either. So there are still regiments that are not yet on the field. And nevertheless, at this point, everybody crashes wherever they can. One of the Jacobite soldiers from the Cameron of Lochiel's regiment didn't even make it back as far as the moor. He collapsed with exhaustion somewhere along the road back. And when he woke in the daylight, it was to the sound of the beating drums of Cumberland's army advancing towards Inverness. And it was him who, by 8 o'clock, had reached Culloden House with the news that the army is on its way.
Hello listeners, this is Andrew. We often say that history is written by the victors, but on this show we know it's actually written by the supply lines, by the weather, and by the difficult decisions made inside the command tent. Sometimes the most interesting part of our recording session isn't the battle narrative, it's the 20-minute debate or analysis we have between the key actions. If you enjoy those what-if moments, I invite you to become part of the Prime and Load War Room on Patreon. For the price of a pint, you can hear the conversations that usually end up on the cutting room floor. You'll also get access to our newsletter, The Orderly Book, as well as exclusive bonus episodes that cover topics we typically don't get to on the main show. So if you're the kind of person who's looking for more 18th century warfare, join the Prime and Load War Room at patreon.com/primeandload.
That sounds absolutely miserable.
Yes, it is. And I think it's also significant because it's the first time, really, that the Jacobite army has made such a mess of an operation where the stakes are this high. In most situations, the Jacobite army, even where there are tensions amongst the senior commanders, has, as a general rule, pulled together at the moment of crisis and surprised both itself and some of its critics. This is not happening anymore. And the situation by the morning of the 16th looks much more desperate than it had looked on the morning of the 15th.
So we could just briefly get back to the forces of goodness and righteousness in the universe. What is Cumberland doing during this? I mean, obviously I'm familiar with... he gives cheese and spirits to the troops because it's his birthday. I believe they briefly hang a 17-year-old lad who's suspected of being a spy and then decide to cut him down about 10 minutes through his hanging, and he does live. Are they blissfully unaware of the Night March? Are they, are there any indication that they decide at the last moment to go on the offensive on the 16th? Is this something Cumberland's planned for a long time? What's going on in the government camp?
Well, I mean, it's business as usual. This is what they intended to do. They've brought their forces over the Spey. They've brought them to Nairn. The enemy is a short march away, and Cumberland is ready, is enthusiastically eager to put an end to a war that he's already said is over. So this they are not in any way sort of following through on an enemy's mistake here. They are simply going on to the offensive as was their intention. And the fact that they are finding Jacobite stragglers along the road is their first serious indication that anything had been happening prior. I don't think that they had any sense of sort of an imminent major all-out attack that previous night or that morning. Having said which, they were absolutely prepared for it. Neither were they in their cups particularly vulnerable. You can argue it might well have been an easier battle for the Jacobites to fight, and Cumberland would have had his backs to the sea, would have had a river running close by his position, and much less freedom of movement. And if the Jacobites had managed to get there, surprise him, attack him from two fronts as they had planned, it would have been a challenge. But it would have been quite difficult to take him by surprise, I think.
And so now it's the morning of the 16th. We've got an exhausted Jacobite army, a government army that's, like you said, is kind of business as usual. Can we kind of get a kind of a mission statement for both of these commanders as we start to move into the actual engagement?
Well, the Jacobite army deploys first, basically. And so it's clear to Cumberland as he's moving towards the field that the Jacobites are going to stand, and so that tells us immediately that from both commanders are seeking a decisive confrontation here. By decisive, I mean that's not to say that Charles Edward wins the war if he wins this battle. thanks to the strategic decisions that have been forced upon him in recent months, he is now geographically further away from London than he has ever been since the beginning of the conflict. Having said which, the benefits of success at this battle would have been immense to the Jacobite cause, absolutely immense, but they don't end the conflict. Cumberland's mission is, of course, to end the conflict, because he believes that not unreasonably, that the Jacobite army, whilst it can recover potentially from strategic mistakes, it would be almost impossible for a rebellion, from his perspective, to survive a major battlefield defeat, and a home defeat as well, because obviously this is now in the Highlands, in the depths of the Highlands, so Cumberland could potentially survive anything that was short of a complete destruction. Another Falkirk-style battle that sees Cumberland's army withdrawing back towards Inverness isn't conclusive. But a Jacobite defeat in the field would be very difficult for them to come back from. So that's Cumberland's mission. As it has been since the beginning of February, it was what Cumberland expected Hawley to have achieved in January. It's what Cumberland himself had expected to achieve in his march from Edinburgh to Stirling at the beginning of February. And that he felt had been denied to him at that point. So it's as simple as that. It is the final suppression of the Jacobite army as a military threat. That's the mission. You can do that by dispersing them, or you can do that by destroying them, and that's it. So the Jacobite army pulls itself together as it comes on. Cumberland doesn't rush up onto the battlefield. It's an orderly advance. It's not easy ground that he's crossing. The weather isn't particularly clement that morning, and they're moving up onto a pretty high moor. That Lisa, you've said you've been there. It's I don't know if it was one of the 3 sunny days of the year that you were there, but it can be pretty rough up on that high moor, which was more open and exposed even than it is today. So they take the time. There are problems with moving some of the artillery through some of the fairly soft ground on the advance, which is observed by the Jacobites themselves, incidentally. So the Jacobites are basically forced to deploy and fight there, or disperse. It's as simple as that. Any debates they might have had of choosing other battlefields are gone. They have to stand and fight where they are if they're going to fight. And so Charles Edward marches up onto the battlefield with Lochiel's regiment, and the army deploys in the order of battle that had been planned for the previous day. So there isn't time to be rejigging the lines and positions to the fact that they're actually further towards the east than they had anticipated. So it's not the position that they had initially expected to fight in, although it's in the same general area. It's pretty fraught that morning as the pipes go up to try and get everybody into their ranks and files. The battle line getting deployed and into position is helped by that Cumberland's relatively steady advance up to the field. The battle itself doesn't begin until after 1 o'clock, and so there is a morning of preparation. As I say, it was sometime after 8 o'clock that the alarm went up, really, amongst the Jacobite lines.
All right, you've armed us. Lead us across the moor.
Well, it is the Jacobites that begin the battle. It is the Jacobite artillery that open fire first to a cheer that ripples up along the Highland line, probably triggered by British staff officers moving out into no man's land and triggering a response. So the Jacobites open the artillery engagement and immediately receive a response from the British batteries. The response is One of the most, I don't want to overstate it, but it is a very controversial element of the battle, is its opening phase. There are some suggestions that the Jacobite army stood on the moor for 20, 30 minutes, being lashed by British artillery, whilst the Prince dithered at the back, wondering, well, why aren't they attacking us? We were supposed to wait for them to come forwards, and then we would counterattack. That is hopelessly undermined by what the British Army tell us themselves, where estimates for the opening artillery exchange range between 2 and 8 or 9 minutes. So it probably felt a lot longer when you were under it. That's probably the reality. And it was probably much, much less effective than it is traditionally seen to have been. The very influential Culloden book by John Preble in the 1960s, and the subsequent sort of the movie of the book, as they say, made by Peter Watkins in the 1960s as well, feed into this very common perception of the Jacobite army standing under this hail of artillery. And just being told to stand and take it, but that doesn't seem to be the case. The British guns were firing into their own smoke for a start after the first shots have been fired, and interestingly, the Jacobite senior commanders around where Charles Edwards is in the sort of centre rear were convinced that they were deliberately targeting the Prince, which doesn't seem that they were, but it perhaps suggests that there's a lot of shot falling in the second line, and so maybe they are overshooting. Obviously, they're on very soft ground here, so you don't want to undershoot because you're not going to get that nice skip on your balls here. But certainly men are killed around Charles Edward. One of his grooms is killed, and eventually it's sufficient for those around the prince to encourage him to move and shift to a new position further to the right. So that potentially gives us an insight as to the effectiveness of that ball, but. Casualties are I don't think, during that artillery exchange, I don't think are reaching 3 figures. But obviously the Jacobite artillery is much less effective than the British artillery. The Jacobite artillery doesn't get a lot of attention, but they're a mix of Scottish troops and, of course, French engineers helping out with them. But they've got a mix of calibers, a mix of ammunitions, and of course they've got a much slower rate of fire as a result. But they are there, they're playing their part, and some of those Jacobite guns are firing right to the bitter end at the end of the engagement. So they get an honorary mention, I think, because they play an important role. Needless to say, once the artillery duel has begun, and it becomes clear that Cumberland isn't going to simply pile headlong across the moor, the Jacobites do what they are accustomed to doing, which is launching an assault on Cumberland's lines. The main charge is led across the front line. There are various sort of slightly confused accounts as to the timings of it. It's staff officers are killed carrying messages along the lines at this point. But there's also another important issue. Over on the right, the Jacobite right, where there's a series of turf and stone-walled enclosures, explicit orders are sent by Sullivan to Murray on the right, telling him to put men in those enclosures. Those orders are, and I don't think this is controversial, they are explicitly ignored, and it just doesn't happen. Those are the same part walls that subsequently are used by government forces to fire into the flanks of the Jacobites. Now, that might not have made a difference to the outcome of the battle, but clearly the fact that there was a threat to the front ranks flank there had been identified by the Jacobite staff, and orders had been sent to do it. One of the problems in this position, I think, is this is the climactic moment of the disastrous relationship between John Sullivan and Lord George Murray. the crucial order to do that is carried to Murray by Sullivan personally, and I think that's why he ignores it. And so it's simply, he may also have thought there's not much point in diluting our force to occupy a position we're about to abandon because we're launching a forward attack. But nevertheless, it's a significant moment. The Jacobite charge goes forwards. That is not the only thing that's happening there. It's the only bit the popular imagination tends to talk about, but it's not the only thing that's happening. The Cumberland has identified that obviously, whilst he's got the main challenge directly to his fore, that he wants to work around the flanks of the Jacobite position as well, and potentially, if he can, threaten his rear. This is delegated to General Hawley, who, unlike General Cope, has survived the embarrassment of his previous defeat and has retained the confidence of the government. So British cavalry are detached to work around the south side of the battlefield towards around the park walls and the enclosures, and to potentially turn into the flank and rear of the Jacobites there. So that's significant. It's observed, and the Jacobites respond to it, and they pull units such as Ogilvy's out of the second line, lowland units, and some of the cavalry squadrons, and move them to form a new line, sort of roughly right angles to the original position, to deter that. And in a simplistic sense, it's a successful response because it prevents Hawley from being able to outflank the main Jacobite position. Of course, it means that they have weakened the second line of the main Jacobite army, and therefore it's not in a position to give as full support to the frontal attack as would have been intended. But that's significant, and it's a level of tactical movement on the battlefield that is often overlooked in the rush to follow the drama of the main charge. The main charge itself is going in over difficult terrain, soft ground, and the landscape isn't entirely flat. There was a road running across it, and especially on the north side, a series of burns cutting across it as well that created sort of marshier, wetter areas. What this essentially does is it means that as the Jacobite front attacks, it loses its cohesion. The right is able to attack with much better order and concentration. The left, particularly the Clandonald men, they are slowed down by the wetter lower ground in front of them, which means that they lose the momentum of their attack and aren't really committed to a full charge in the ideal way. And so, what do they do in response? Once they get close, they start returning fire, and so they get into a fire exchange, which goes back to the point we were saying about the equipment and the sort of nature of the Jacobite army there. They feel that they are capable of standing and exchanging fire with the enemy at that point. But it means that what we don't have is an attack happening with the same intensity across the whole length of the line. Inevitably, the sort of motion of the forward drive prefers to stick to the higher, drier sections of the ground, and as they're going in, for the first time, the Jacobite charge is subjected now to close quarters artillery fire and canister shot as they're going in. And this has a big impact. Obviously, it increases casualties on the charge. It also encourages that charge to start to bunch and lose cohesion. And what essentially happens is the right of centre starts to merge into the right of the Jacobite charge, creating a very powerful block that's surging towards the British lines, but of course inevitably also subsequently weakening the force of the attack in the centre. So a sort of sucking of momentum over to the Jacobite right as it's going forwards. Amongst the casualties, one of the weaknesses, if you want to put it that way, of the Jacobite, the Highland attack, is always that you expose your best men to the greatest risk at the first moments of the attack. And we have Cameron of Lochiel, for example, one of the great talisman of the Highland army, falling as his legs are pulled under him by canister shot as is going forwards. I've seen the targe that he carried that day, and it's riddled with great gaping holes. And so you've got senior men falling at the charge as it's going forwards, as we've seen at Falkirk and at Prestonpans too. That charge smashes into the British line, but as it's going in, the indications from some of the archaeological work at Culloden suggest that the British mortars are firing over their front lines directly into the charging Jacobite lines to do as much as possible to break up that charge and its momentum. Fragments of mortar shells, really quite close to the position of the British front line, suggesting that was considered essential and maybe a risk worth taking there to break up that big mass of Highlanders that goes in. Where it hits, famously, funneling all its force onto Barrel's regiment, the Jacobite line bowls through. It penetrates the line, but it has gone a long way over soft ground with exhausted men. It's penetrated the front line, and it finds a second line behind it. Cumberland is not sat idle. He's pushing units forwards to where they need to be. He can read where the threat is going to be, and the gap is essentially plugged. And then, as we had seen to an extent on the Jacobite left at the Battle of Falkirk, when the Jacobite charge is stalled and stopped confronted with heavy firepower, when it's static, it has to go backwards. The Jacobites in their charge generally throw down their guns, so you can't suddenly stop your charge and then exchange fire. If the momentum of the attack falters, you've got nowhere to go. And so, having taken really quite significant casualties on that charge, they now have to go. And as at Falkirk, they go backwards. And this is where Murray's position on the line, the Athol Brigade, and others, and everyone who's been sucked into that, and they are driven back. As they are driven back, they are enfiladed by the Argyll militia that have moved up into the enclosures that Sullivan had ordered Murray to defend. So now we have a very serious situation for the Jacobites. Would have been even worse had Hawley been able to execute his intended manoeuvre around to their rear. But the fact that the Jacobites have had to weaken their second line in order to fend off that flanking movement means that the Jacobite second line is extremely thin. So you now have a number of things happen, as again had happened at Falkirk. The French units are pushed forwards to try and stem the tide of the rollback, and over on the left, the Jacobite regiments that had not gone into the hand-to-hand phase of engagement yet start to pull back. They can see that the situation is deteriorating on the right, but they can also see that Cumberland is threatening to move his dragoons round on the Jacobite left as well. As soon as the Jacobite army attacks, it loses the protection of the Culloden Park walls, and so it exposes its flank. And there's no way of avoiding that if your tactic is to attack. And so the Jacobite left begins to withdraw and makes a fighting withdrawal on the left. And as it does so, back to my honorary mention to the artillery, it is covered by the artillery fire on the Jacobite left that at a crucial moment deters an immediate response by the British Dragoons. All of that is very quick. That's a half hour or so is very intense action. And then what we have is essentially a general advance from the British Army into the wake of the failure of the charge. And the Jacobite army has different experiences depending whereabouts on the field you are. But there are considerable, significant portions of that army which have either been minimally engaged or are not sufficiently pressed at the immediate moment of crisis that they cannot extricate themselves. So we have a collapse of the Jacobite right and a considerable portion of its front line, but a relatively intact portion of the Jacobite army on the left and the second lines. And so they are now starting to try and extricate themselves from the situation.
All right, so Aaron, now that the battle is more or less over, what kind of casualties are we looking at on the field after all of this?
Well, on the Jacobite side, it is significant. Now, what's extremely difficult for us to do is try and parse the figures in terms of what extent the extent of the damage of the artillery duel was against what the extent of the damage was done in the charge compared to what is the extent of the damage in the breaking of the charge and the subsequent retreat. To a degree, other than people like ourselves who want to get that deep, it doesn't make a difference because the Jacobite army is leaving perhaps 2,000 men on the field at Culloden, which compared to perhaps 50 or 60 at Prestonpans, 70 or 80 at Falkirk, is a massive blow to its capacity, but also to its psychology. So these are. It is a difficult figure for the Jacobite army because there is an exceptionally challenging distinction between wounded on the field and killed on the field, and those killed in the immediate subsequent aftermath. The government forces famously produced a Jacobite order that no quarter was to be given to the British troops in the case of a Jacobite victory, almost certainly a forgery, and it was used to make sure that there were not a high proportion of Jacobite wounded on the battlefield in its aftermath. It's interesting if you look at it. For example, if you compare it to Prestonpans, where you had maybe about 400 or so British soldiers killed, and maybe about 1,200 or so taken prisoner. At Culloden, we have the Jacobites with maybe about 400 taken prisoner and maybe 1,500, 2,000 men killed. So that is a significant reversal of proportions, and that's because of the nature of the treatment of wounded men in the immediate aftermath of the Jacobite army's defeat. But that is clearly what proves to be a fatal blow to the Jacobite army. By contrast, the government forces own to about 50 killed outright on the field, but not an insignificant number of wounded, perhaps 250 to 300 men registered as wounded in the battle, which is indicative of the intensity of the fight in a very concentrated part of the British line. So clearly, it's one-sided, and it's of course inevitably. It is during the breaking of that charge, not the hand-to-hand fight itself, but the streaming of those men away from the battlefield under fire all the time, and then subsequently pursued, is what makes the difference there. So it's a bloody hour's work, and it's one that the Jacobite army cannot recover from.
And so, Aaron, I know we don't want to get too much into the aftermath, because we will be doing an aftermath episode all about not just the aftermath of this battle, but a lot of the other kind of winding down of these of the rebellion as a whole. But as a historian of the Jacobite rebellions, this is kind of the climactic moment. And you mentioned there's a lot of 19th century and 1960s romanticism. What are some of the big myths about Culloden that maybe drive you nuts, or you'd like to kind of set the record straight?
Well, there's lots of layers to this, and as you say, some of which are sort of more general that we come to. I mean, the biggest thing is perhaps what we've already touched on about the nature and capacity of the Jacobite army when it goes into this battle. In the grand strategic sense, the Jacobite cause has been defeated at this point. It is very hard to see how the Jacobite army, even if it's successful in this engagement, is able to turn this situation around to a position from which it can win the war without major intervention from outside now. But I think it's for me. It's the same. There are all sorts of layers to this. There are still people out there, despite all of the evidence and despite, to be fair, generations of historians banging on about it, that this is not a conflict between England and Scotland. It is not a conflict between Protestant and Catholic. It is not a case of haughty, wealthy, privileged aristos leading brave but simple men out of the mountains out of a sense of duty and nothing else, and then sacrificing them for their own ambitions. None of those things are reasonable interpretations of Culloden. And yet all of those things are interpretations of Culloden that you encounter. And so not only are they wrong, they're also potentially quite dangerous as interpretations in terms of their effects. The other that particularly grinds me, and this probably is no surprise for people who've listened to 6 episodes of me talking about it now, is the perceptions of Charles Edward himself. There is still those who believe that Charles Edward should have left all of the decisions and all of the responsibility onto the shoulders of Lord George Murray in particular and others around him. And I think it's clear that Lord George Murray was just as limited in his abilities to lead this army to success as anybody else potentially was. Charles Edward knew this was going to be an extremely difficult battle. It's not a battle or a position he ever wanted to find himself in. He had predicted this situation himself back in late January, when he had said, before the retreat from Stirling, do we believe that we're going to be in any stronger position to defeat the Duke of Cumberland in the north in a few weeks' time than we are right now here in the Lowlands? In which case he was in a position down there at Stirling with 8,000 or 9,000 men at his disposal, rather than the 6,000 he ended up fighting with at Culloden. So all of those things wrap in. Charles Edward's military ability and his role in 1745 generally are viewed so commonly and understandably through the lens of Culloden. How do you argue, and I've been doing it for a while and I know the challenge, how do you argue that this man and his army are militarily capable when they are defeated? That is the challenge, and the perception is that because he was defeated, and because he was defeated very badly, and all of the subsequent baggage that we'll no doubt be talking of next time, that it must have been his fault. And they should never have even attempted it. And so all of those things frustrate me immensely because they take away a lot of the nuance and the reality, and they do a hideous disservice, not only to Charles Edward himself, but also to all the people who came out and fought for him. Because yes, you can make arguments about the scale of Jacobite conscription and so on, but the reality is that the majority of the men on that field in the Jacobite army had put their trust in him and had done so through calculation and belief and commitment, not simply out of some archaic sense of clan feudal loyalty. And so I think it's about giving fairness and credit to all of those involved, and looking beyond the outcome in terms of how we assess people's abilities and motivations. The other problem, of course, with this battle is that the British army also is laden down with baggage, with everything that comes subsequent to the battle, and therefore it becomes very difficult to have a serious and honest discussion about the British Army's position in the battle, to the extent that it's even difficult to commemorate the British Army's casualties in the battle, for example. You won't hear many wreaths being laid for the British soldiers who died on the battlefield on the anniversary in a couple of weeks' time from this recording, for example. So it is a battle that has been willfully sometimes misinterpreted, is commonly misunderstood, and politicized to the extent that it's very difficult to shake people into the realities. All we can do is keep going back to the words of the people that were there.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with the link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date with the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino. Music by Brianna Tam, Ardi Son, and Adrian Beringer. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.